It wasn't built to turn heads, it was built to last. But something about the new Honda CG150 didn't sit right. The numbers looked fine, the frame looked familiar, but under the surface, things had changed. And for riders expecting the same durability as the 125, the truth came fast, and not in a good way. This is the shocking truth behind the new Honda CG150, and why the people who needed it most felt left behind. A legacy they tried to reinvent. It started with a promise. In the mid-1970s, Honda introduced a motorcycle that didn't chase headlines or performance trophies. It chased something far more enduring: trust. The Honda CG125 wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, but it worked. Day after day, year after year. In places where reliability wasn't a feature, it was a necessity. Across Asia, Latin America, Africa, and beyond, the CG125 became more than just a commuter. It became a lifeline. Couriers, farmers, factory workers, and mechanics all pointed to one truth. If you needed to get there and keep getting there, this was the machine that made it happen. At the heart of that loyalty was a simple formula: a pushrod engine built with ruggedness in mind. Fewer moving parts, minimal electronics, and an air-cooled design that could survive punishing heat, dust, and road abuse. Maintenance wasn't just easy, it was possible almost anywhere, even without a proper shop. Carburetors could be tuned with a screwdriver, valves adjusted with a wrench. You didn't need a diagnostic tool, you needed patience and a few basic spares. And when something went wrong, it rarely stayed wrong for long. That's why the bike earned a reputation not just as reliable, but indestructible. For decades, Honda left that legacy untouched. They made minor tweaks, new lights, better seats, a refreshed logo here and there. But the engine stayed the same. The layout stayed the same. Riders knew what to expect, and more importantly, knew how to fix what went wrong. So when Honda announced a new model, the CG150, many assumed it would build on that same core. A bit more power, maybe better fuel economy, but the same bones underneath. What they got was something else entirely. The Honda CG150 was marketed as the next logical step, a refined version of the classic. Stronger, smoother, smarter. Honda didn't say they were replacing a legend. They said they were upgrading it. But as soon as riders got their hands on the new machine, the questions started. Because while the CG150 shared the name, it didn't share the feel. And the deeper you looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't evolution. This was a rewrite. Gone was the old pushrod engine. In its place, an overhead camshaft design, fed by a more sophisticated fuel system and tuned for cleaner combustion. On paper, it made sense. The new engine displaced 149.2 cubic centimeters, a modest increase over the 125. The throttle response was smoother, vibration was reduced, emissions dropped to meet tightening standards across international markets. But under all that polish was a truth Honda didn't emphasize. This engine wasn't built to be fixed in a field. It was built to pass inspection in a lab. That shift might not sound dramatic to a casual buyer, but to the riders who had spent years trusting their livelihoods to the CG platform, it felt like a betrayal. The overhead cam design meant more moving parts, more precision, more things that could go wrong, and fewer that could be patched up with simple tools. The older CGs were forgiving machines. You could misalign a timing mark, run rough oil, even push past service intervals, and still expect it to get you home. The CG150 demanded more care, more specific parts, and more factory-trained service. But it wasn't just the engine. The frame had been reworked as well, taller, slightly wider, with revised geometry that prioritized road comfort over raw durability. Honda touted these changes as improvements. A better ride, smoother suspension, more ergonomic controls. But in the places where roads weren't roads, just dirt, stone, and punishment, those refinements didn't feel like upgrades. They felt like softness, the kind of softness that breaks when pushed too hard. Then, there was the emissions gear. Riders noticed quickly that the new CG150 ran hotter. Not dangerously so, but noticeably. That heat came from the tighter combustion requirements, paired with a leaner fuel mixture. It was efficient, it was clean, but it meant that in hotter climates or longer rides, the engine didn't cool as easily. That wasn't something you'd find in the brochures. You'd find it on the side of the road, when a delivery rider had to let the engine breathe after hours in traffic. And if something did go wrong, replacing the emissions components often meant hunting for parts that weren't available in rural shops. Parts with sensors, modules, and wiring not found on older CGs. The backlash was quiet, but it was real. Not a media firestorm. Not a social media campaign. Just conversations between mechanics and riders. It's not the same. They made it too complicated. Why did they change what wasn't broken? These weren't the words of critics. They were the words of people who had depended on Honda machines for decades, now feeling like that trust had been rewritten in fine print. The CG150 wasn't unreliable, but it was unfamiliar. And for a platform built on trust, that was almost worse. What Honda didn't mention in the press materials was this. The CG150 wasn't made to carry the same torch. It was made to survive a different kind of pressure, emission standards, urban regulations, and global compliance. It didn't need to be easier to fix. It needed to be easier to approve. And for a company as large as Honda, that trade-off made business sense. But for the rider deep in the mountains of Colombia, or the delivery worker in Karachi, or the mechanic in Lagos, it didn't make sense at all. It just made the bike harder to believe in. And that's where the story begins. Not with the specs on a showroom floor, but with a question whispered in every alleyway and garage across the global south. Did Honda make this bike for us, or for someone else entirely? The engine that split a fan base. And that question only got louder when riders took the new CG150 out for a real ride. Because once you moved past the paint and the promises, what you felt most wasn't refinement. It was restraint. The engine, clocking in at 149.2 cubic centimeters, was supposed to be the crown jewel of the redesign. Honda called it modern, cleaner, more efficient. But for the riders who'd spent years on the 125, that engine didn't feel like a step forward. It felt like a stranger. On paper, it had everything. An overhead camshaft layout for smoother valve timing, a higher compression ratio for improved combustion. Paired with a lean burn fuel system and CDI ignition, it checked all the boxes for emission compliance in countries trying to align with Euro standards. That was the point. This wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. A power plant engineered to squeeze through environmental loopholes, glide under regulatory radar, and come out the other side with a clean bill of health. But in doing so, it lost something the older CG engines had in spades: character. The pushrod thump of the old CG125 was rough, raw, and immediate. You felt every pulse through the pegs. It responded like a machine that wanted to be understood, not just used. The new CG150, by contrast, felt filtered. Smoother, yes. Quieter, definitely. But also disconnected. And when riders took it off paper and onto the pavement, those numbers started to blur. Because while the engine was technically bigger, the power didn't feel stronger. On flat roads and light loads, it moved just fine. But add a passenger, a steep hill, or a headwind, and it showed its limits. The torque delivery, hovering around 9.8 pound-feet, didn't come early enough to be useful on inclines, and didn't peak hard enough to push past slower traffic with confidence. You could rev it higher, but the payoff felt soft. Not slow, exactly, just uninspired. Highway stretches told a similar story. Riders who expected the CG150 to hold speed like the 125 found themselves downshifting more than usual. At sustained throttle, the engine buzzed instead of pulling. You could push it, but it didn't push back with the kind of urgency older riders remembered. For a bike that was supposed to offer more, it often delivered less where it mattered most. The real tension, though, wasn't just about how the bike felt. It was about what it became. Mechanics, especially in the rural shops and back alley garages, where the CG earned its reputation, started giving the new engine a quiet nickname: too clean to fix. It wasn't meant as praise. What they meant was simple. The new CG150 had been engineered so precisely, so tightly regulated, that the usual tricks no longer applied. Spark advance was handled by CDI timing, sealed and untouchable. Fuel delivery was mapped into the carburetor's jetting, leaving little room to tinker without replacement parts. Sensors and emission circuits ran in line with the ignition, meaning a small electrical fault could sideline the entire bike. And diagnosing that fault wasn't something you could do with a voltmeter and a steady hand. This wasn't a machine you could nurse back to life on the side of the road. It was a machine that needed a bench, a multimeter, and preferably a certified shop. That shift wasn't just inconvenient. It was a philosophical break from what made the CG platform legendary. Older riders had built their trust in Honda around a machine that let them participate in the fix. That trust wasn't based on perfection. It was based on predictability. When something went wrong, it could be solved. The CG150, for all its precision, didn't offer that same promise. And that's where the divide began to grow. Younger riders, especially those who were new to motorcycles or didn't grow up working on carburetors, didn't mind the changes. To them, the cleaner idle, smoother throttle, and quieter ride made sense. It was easier to learn on, easier to live with. The electronic ignition was more reliable until it wasn't. And when it failed, they didn't reach for a toolbox. They reached for a warranty. But for the old school crowd, that logic didn't hold. A bike wasn't supposed to be just a ride. It was supposed to be yours. something you understood inside and out, something you trusted. The CG150 broke that connection. It worked well enough, sure, but it didn't invite the same confidence. It didn't ask to be understood. It just asked to be used. In garages, on forums, and roadside stalls across 3 continents, riders kept repeating the same line in different languages. It's not a bad bike, it's just not a CG, because what Honda had built was something new, something efficient, but also something that, in trying to satisfy regulations, had stopped satisfying the people who built its legacy in the first place. The engine didn't just change the ride, it changed the relationship. And for a bike that once stood for loyalty, that shift was harder to accept than any spec sheet could explain. We've seen the legacy, the shift, and the cracks starting to form. But the deeper issues, those are still coming. Hit like if you've noticed the change, subscribe for what's next, and stay with us. The truth only gets sharper from here. Designed for cities, abused in the wild. And once that relationship was broken, it didn't take long for the cracks to show elsewhere. Because the real test of the CG150 wasn't in spec sheets or emissions charts, it was in the hands of the riders who didn't care about either. The delivery workers weaving through traffic with overloaded racks, the farmhands riding 10 miles off pavement before sunrise, the rental shops pushing bikes through back-to-back customers without a moment to cool. These were the people who built the CG legend. And when the new model arrived, they treated it the same way they had treated the old one, like a machine that could take anything. The problem was, it couldn't. The CG150 was tuned for the city, designed to handle paved streets, regulated speeds, and moderate loads. In that environment, it behaved just fine. Predictable throttle, decent brakes, manageable weight. But once it was pulled into harsher conditions, dust, heat, gravel, hills, it started revealing limits that Honda never advertised. The suspension was one of the first warning signs. Softer than the previous generation, calibrated more for urban comfort than rural resilience. It soaked up speed bumps, but struggled on broken terrain. Fork seals wore out within the first 5,000 miles on rough roads. Rear shocks bottomed out under loads approaching 300 pounds. And while a softer ride might have seemed like an upgrade on paper, in the field, it meant less control and more maintenance. Vibration was another issue that caught riders off guard. For a bike marketed as smoother and more refined, the CG150 developed buzzes and shakes in all the wrong places. Foot pegs, bars, mirrors, none of them stayed still at higher revolutions. At cruising speeds around 55 miles per hour, the handlebars transmitted a constant buzz that made long-distance riding uncomfortable. Mechanics pointed to frame harmonics and the tighter engine tolerances introduced with the overhead cam setup. But riders didn't care why it vibrated. They cared that it did, especially when hours on the saddle turned a small buzz into a numbing rattle. And that vibration wasn't just a comfort issue, it was a durability problem. Bolts loosened, panels cracked, mirror stems bent out of alignment. On older CGs, these were the kinds of issues that showed up after 50,000 miles of hard use. On the 150, they showed up after a few hard months. Chain slack became noticeable before 2,000 miles on fully loaded bikes. Rear sprockets wore down by the 6,000 mile mark in some cases, half the lifespan expected from earlier models. The engine mounts didn't fare much better. Riders pushing long distances on poorly paved roads began reporting mount bolts backing out, even with thread lock applied. And on long-haul stretches, ones that kept the engine spinning near 6,500 revolutions per minute, the bike's temperature climbed steadily. That 149.2 cubic centimeter engine ran lean, and lean engines run hot. Ambient temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit pushed oil temps beyond 270 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes leading to early breakdown of conventional oils and gasket seepage. In extended use conditions, even clutch plates began to show signs of glazing before 10,000 miles, a warning sign for riders expecting the usual CG lifespan of 30,000 miles or more without internal repair. None of this was obvious at the point of sale. Most buyers saw the CG150 as a slight upgrade over the 125. A little more power, a little more refinement, a little more comfort. But those upgrades were tuned for commutes, not punishment. And in markets where a motorcycle is the job, not just the way to it, that difference mattered. The CG150 could handle the city, but outside its comfort zone, in the dust, in the heat, in the chaos, it struggled. And that struggle wasn't loud. It didn't come with catastrophic engine failure or dramatic breakdowns. It came with little things: sagging shocks, fading torque, rattling pegs. One by one, they added up. Honda didn't respond. There were no region-specific updates, no adjusted specs, no official advisories about use cases. Instead, the company let the machine speak for itself. And in the wild, where one bike might rack up 20,000 miles in a single year, that message was clear. A global bike that couldn't stay the same. Underneath the same badge, riders started discovering they weren't riding the same machine. The CG150 may have looked consistent on the surface, but country by country, the bike was anything but standardized. In Brazil, in Pakistan, in the Philippines, and Nigeria, the so-called global Honda didn't arrive as one motorcycle. It arrived as a collection of regional compromises, each one shaped by different suppliers, different tolerances, and different expectations. From the outside, most riders wouldn't notice. The frame looked familiar. The engine cases were cast the same. But the moment the bike was put to use, the differences began to show. Some versions idled rougher, some ran hotter, some pulled clean off the line, while others struggled under even moderate weight. Riders buying the CG name expected uniformity. What they got depended entirely on where they lived, and in many cases, on which factory assembled the parts. Brazil's CG150 was the most stable version, assembled domestically with consistent tolerances and some of Honda's tighter in-house controls. The ride quality was firm, throttle response was predictable, and electrical systems held up well under pressure. In contrast, the Pakistani version, built under local licensing agreements, often featured cheaper switchgear, looser fit-on body panels, and cable routing that invited early wear. Philippine units came with different ignition timing altogether, mapped to meet local fuel blend, which often sacrificed performance in high-heat environments. In West African markets like Nigeria, bikes were shipped with leaner carb setups and softer suspension tuning that prioritized economy over endurance. Riders expected the CG name to mean something fixed, but in truth, no two countries received exactly the same CG150. It went deeper than just assembly. Carburetors weren't calibrated to a universal standard. Jetting varied across regions, leading to inconsistent throttle feel and idle stability. Some bikes came tuned lean to pass local emissions checks, which made them choke under load or stall in traffic. Others ran slightly richer but guzzled more fuel and fouled plugs faster. Spark timing was adjusted at the factory depending on national fuel grades, with no documentation made available to local mechanics. For couriers, fleet owners, or rural riders trying to troubleshoot their bikes, that meant guesswork. A fix that worked in one country didn't necessarily work in another. Even frame welds, swing arm tolerances, and plastics came from different suppliers depending on the country. That meant vibration levels weren't consistent. Panel fit varied. Parts that should have been interchangeable, mirrors, levers, foot pegs, sometimes weren't. Riders who had owned the CG125 expected that any part could be swapped in a pinch. With the CG150, those assumptions started to fail. A brake cable from a Nigerian unit didn't always fit a Philippine one. A throttle body tuned for South America didn't behave the same way in South Asia. All of this chipped away at the very foundation of what the CG name once stood for: uniformity, interchangeability, predictability. Those weren't just perks. They were part of the CG's identity. And now, that identity had been fractured. Honda hadn't just changed the design. They had changed what it meant to own one. What made it worse was how quietly it happened. There were no clear regional spec sheets, no warnings at the point of sale. Riders bought a CG150 expecting a certain experience, and what they got depended on a VIN code buried in the paperwork and a supply chain they couldn't see. Some got lucky, others got frustrated. And once those comparisons started to circulate through forums, mechanic shops, or simple word of mouth, the trust that had carried the CG line for decades began to break apart. This wasn't about reliability anymore, it was about uncertainty. The CG150 still ran. It still started in the morning, but in a world where riders needed consistency more than comfort, Honda had introduced something far more damaging than mechanical failure: doubt. The problems they didn't recall. That creeping uncertainty only deepened once the early mechanical problems started to surface, quietly at first, then with growing frequency. The CG150 may have been presented as a refined evolution, but for riders who used it day in and day out, the warning signs weren't hard to spot. They didn't come with recalls, they didn't come with headlines, they came with real-world breakdowns: sudden fuel starvation, cracked exhaust headers, leaking head gaskets, and most of all, silence from the very company that built its reputation on reliability. One of the earliest red flags was the fuel delivery system. On paper, it was simple, gravity-fed in most markets, with a vacuum-actuated fuel tap or, in some regions, a compact electric pump. But in practice, that simplicity didn't hold. Riders began reporting loss of power under sustained throttle, not the gradual fade of a clogged filter, but the abrupt hesitation of fuel supply being cut mid-ride. In hot climates, especially where stop-and-go traffic kept the engine temperatures rising, the symptoms became more frequent. Mechanics initially blamed dirty fuel or blocked lines, but the real issue was more persistent: fuel pumps or vacuum diaphragms that failed prematurely, sometimes before 10,000 miles. In countries like the Philippines and Nigeria, where warranty enforcement was inconsistent at best, these failures were treated as wear and tear, not defects. Then came the exhaust problems. Around the 6,000-mile mark, riders began noticing a sharp rattle from under the bike. In some cases, it was a loose bracket. In others, it was something worse, a visible fracture along the exhaust manifold where the pipe met the engine. Heat cycling had begun to take its toll. The thin-gauge steel, paired with constant vibration and uneven road stress, led to fatigue cracks. These weren't cosmetic blemishes, they affected performance. Exhaust leaks, reduced back pressure, altered fueling, and in some cases led to carbon buildup around the exhaust valves. Still, no bulletin came from Honda. The bikes kept being sold, the problems kept recurring. But the most serious issue, and the one most mechanics quietly dreaded, was the growing number of head gasket failures. This wasn't a one-off problem, it was a pattern. Over time, owners began reporting persistent oil seepage around the cylinder head. Not gushing, not catastrophic, but steady. Some bikes began burning oil. Others developed coolant leaks in models where liquid cooling had been added in later variants. Tearing down the top end revealed the same culprit again and again: a compressed or partially failed gasket, unable to seal under sustained thermal load. For a bike running a 149.2 cubic centimeter engine with tight emission-tuned tolerances, even a minor leak had consequences: loss of compression, rough idle, overheating, and once again, no recall. These weren't isolated complaints. They began appearing across forums and local mechanic pages in multiple languages. Riders in Sao Paulo, Manila, Karachi, and Lagos, all describing the same failures, the same symptoms, the same silent treatment. Some had receipts. Others had photos of disassembled engines posted online, complete with part numbers and torque specs. But what they didn't have was a service bulletin or an official acknowledgement from Honda. Dealerships were inconsistent at best. Some refused to perform warranty repairs without visible catastrophic failure. Others offered out-of-pocket fixes, but denied it was a design flaw. In many developing markets, the burden of proof fell entirely on the rider, and in regions where access to legal recourse was minimal and consumer protections were weak, riders had little choice but to pay for the repair and move on. For a company that once marketed its motorcycles as indestructible tools for the working class, this silence felt personal. The question that began to form wasn't whether these problems existed. They clearly did. The question was whether Honda knew, and if they did, why they didn't act. In wealthier markets, a head gasket issue would trigger a technical service bulletin. A fractured exhaust would be flagged in production. A fuel system failure might even lead to a campaign. But in the markets where the CG150 did most of its work, where motorcycles weren't toys or weekend rides, but daily tools, those issues were met with quiet indifference. Maybe Honda saw the numbers and decided the failure rates were acceptable. Maybe the cost of a recall outweighed the reputational damage in markets where brand loyalty ran deep and alternatives were few. Or maybe, as some mechanics began to believe, these problems were quietly known but left off the record, a cost of doing business in places where accountability was harder to demand. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Riders kept fixing the same issues. Mechanics kept ordering the same gaskets, welding the same cracks, replacing the same fuel pumps. And every time they did, the gap between Honda's image and Honda's reality widened just a little more. Why governments love it but riders don't. And while riders were left dealing with quiet failures and unanswered questions, regulators were doing something else entirely. They were applauding. Because from the perspective of government agencies, inspection boards, and environmental committees, the CG150 was exactly what they wanted to see. It was clean, quiet, and capped. It didn't challenge speed limits. It didn't spike emissions monitors. It didn't outgrow licensing thresholds. On paper, it was a dream. And that was the problem. In many developing countries, motorcycle regulation doesn't just concern safety, it's about control. Engines over a certain size require more documentation. Higher speeds mean higher risk. Anything with aggressive torque or rapid acceleration gets flagged as a liability, a vehicle that could cause trouble in dense, chaotic traffic systems. The CG150 avoided all of that. Its 149.2 cubic centimeter engine came in just under the upper regulatory ceiling in most jurisdictions. That meant fewer restrictions, easier import approval, and a smoother path through customs and transport authorities. It wasn't designed to test limits. It was designed to meet them, exactly. Emissions were another box the bike checked neatly. Tuned, lean, fed by carefully jetted carburetors, or basic electronic injection systems in certain regions, the CG150 produced impressively low carbon output per mile. In areas that had begun enforcing light-duty emissions testing, particularly urban zones in South America and Southeast Asia, this mattered. Regulators weren't looking for durability or rider satisfaction. They were looking for numbers, and Honda gave them what they wanted. Steady-state tests at idle, low nitrogen oxide readings, minimal unburnt hydrocarbons, a pass rate that made lawmakers smile, even if riders weren't. Then there was the top speed, or lack of it. In its standard form, the CG150 topped out between 65 and 70 miles per hour, depending on elevation, weight, and gearing. That might not sound limiting, but for countries managing overburdened roadways and high accident rates, it was ideal. A motorcycle that couldn't outrun traffic enforcement, couldn't get ahead of itself on open roads, and couldn't easily be repurposed for illegal street racing, that was a win. It meant fewer tickets, fewer injuries, and fewer headlines. The licensing advantages added even more appeal. In countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, and parts of West Africa, anything under 150 cubic centimeters often fell under lighter licensing categories. That meant lower fees, fewer requirements, and easier access for first-time riders. It also meant broader adoption. Governments liked that. A commuter-friendly motorcycle that could be taxed, tracked, and standardized without introducing legal headaches. It wasn't just convenient, it was policy-friendly. Some municipalities even offered incentives, discounted registration, reduced toll rates, or access to inner-city roads, otherwise restricted to commercial traffic. But here's where the praise began to turn. Because while governments were handing out approvals, riders were starting to feel the difference. What looked efficient on a form didn't feel powerful on a hill. What passed an emissions test didn't always pass the test of daily use. A predictable power curve might be easy to regulate, but it's not what a courier needs when overtaking a bus at 40 miles per hour with 100 pounds of cargo strapped to the back. The CG150 may have pleased the rule makers, but the people who actually depended on it felt something else entirely: betrayed. The complaints weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. Not enough pull when loaded. Sluggish throttle response in traffic. A top speed that felt like a ceiling, not a guideline. And for the riders who had grown up with the CG125, who remembered when it could climb hills fully loaded, take abuse for years, and still feel alive, this new version didn't just feel neutered. It felt like it had been built for someone else. Because in truth, it had. The CG150 wasn't designed for the rider anymore. It was designed for the reviewer, the regulator, the clerk who stamped the import approval. Every part of it, from the emissions hardware to the soft throttle, had been optimized not for performance, but for permission. It was built to pass, built to clear, built to exist within boundaries. Honda didn't advertise it that way, of course. They talked about refinement. They mentioned comfort, efficiency, compliance, but the riders knew better. They knew what it meant when a machine was engineered around restrictions instead of realities. They didn't see a better bike. They saw a quieter one, a safer one, and in some ways, a weaker one. And that shift, subtle as it was, landed hard. Because riders didn't need a bike that made lawmakers comfortable. They needed one that made sense when the pavement ran out, when the traffic jam didn't move, when the delivery had to happen. What they got was a motorcycle that lived on paper first, and on the road second. And for the people who relied on it, that order was exactly backwards. The modding movement that rejected the stock version. That backward logic didn't go unnoticed. And for many riders, especially those who remembered what the CG used to be, acceptance wasn't an option. Instead, they turned to resistance, not through protests or press, but through parts. In backstreet garages, roadside stalls, and quiet workshops, a different version of the CG150 began to take shape. One that didn't follow the rules, one that didn't wait for permission, one that was built not to comply but to reclaim. The modding movement around the CG150 wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. It started with the basics, riders bypassing the stock CDI units, replacing them with programmable ignition modules that restored spark advance and pulled timing out of the grip of emissions mapping. Others threw out the factory carburetors entirely, swapping in larger aftermarket units with richer jetting, tuned not for lab conditions, but for real loads, steep grades, and hot weather. Air filters were widened, exhaust pipes were opened up. The goal wasn't aesthetics, it was performance. Riders weren't trying to stand out, they were trying to get back what was lost. And the difference wasn't subtle. A properly tuned CG150, fitted with a performance carburetor and a free-flow exhaust, felt like an entirely different machine. Throttle lag disappeared, mid-range torque came alive. The bike could now hold its pace uphill without constant downshifts, even with an extra 100 pounds on the back. Top speeds jumped by 5 to 10 miles per hour, depending on gearing. More importantly, the bike felt responsive again, like it was finally working with the rider instead of holding back. Even basic changes made a visible impact. Swapping out the restrictive airbox for a high-flow cone filter allowed the engine to breathe, especially in dusty climates, where airflow often came at a cost. Replacing the factory exhaust, tuned for silence over performance, with a less restrictive pipe shaved off weight and improved throttle response across the board. For riders using the bike as their livelihood, those gains weren't just numbers. They were time saved, loads carried, hills climbed without hesitation. What made this movement different was its intent. This wasn't customization for style. It wasn't about chrome or paint or turning heads at a meet. This was rejection, a silent mechanical protest against a design that had stripped the CG of the traits that once made it indispensable. Riders weren't adding flair. They were undoing restrictions, removing the compromises, one part at a time. And they weren't doing it for performance bragging rights. They were doing it because they had to, because the stock version wasn't built for the realities they faced. It was built for forms, not function. By modding their bikes, they weren't just tuning machines, they were restoring identity, bringing back the responsiveness, the power, the trust that had been buried under emissions rules and approval ratings. Honda didn't acknowledge this movement, but they didn't need to, because for many riders, restoring the CG150 wasn't about making it something new. It was about making something right. And in doing so, they revealed the simple truth at the heart of the entire story. The bike never needed to be reinvented. It just needed to be left alone. The CG150 wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a decision, a line between what was and what's now expected. Was it worth the trade? Let us know below. And if you believe motorcycles should still earn their place, hit like and subscribe now.